Before we dive in, hit the subscribe button for more expert insights and honest conversations on Raising Mama podcast. Listen to the full episode at the link in the description.
So, birth spacing. This is based on the work of anthropologist Sarah Hardy. I like to cite my sources. This is her original thinking. She is an anthropologist, but she spent a lot of her career as a primatologist, so looking at like other monkey species and ape species. And so her observation was, okay, orangutans have their babies 8 years apart. Chimpanzees have their babies like 6 years apart on average. And that's really interesting because, you know, if you're someone who likes to watch animal documentaries and you've ever seen a gorilla baby or an ape baby, sorry, did I say gorilla or orangutan? It's orangutans that have 8 years apart. I think gorillas are closer. But anyway, they space their children.
We wouldn't have caught that, but
no, far apart.
Totally
their
different.
children, their babies, far apart. And despite the fact that their babies develop much more quickly, human babies are super immature at birth, like the most immature animal at birth, and they take longer to develop into independent entities than any other species. So it's surprising that humans would have evolved to space their children closer together relative to the great apes, right? And so two observations about that. One is, well, actually, I don't think that we evolved to space our children 2 years apart. It was more like 4. That's usually the average spacing in hunter-gatherer societies. And then the other interesting thing is that, okay, well, 4 years is still shorter than the great ape ancestors, right? Or than our ancestor with the great apes, probably, we think. Why would that be? And the theory is that we were only able to evolve shorter birth spacing because we evolved to parent communally. And because that alleviated stress and pressure on mothers, allowed them to forage more efficiently and to like regain their strength and kick into like a new ovulatory cycle. And so what's interesting is that in the modern context, because of the way that we have set up our food systems and because we don't breastfeed for as long, it's possible for women to have children very close together. Like the reproductive biology around that works. But like mentally, I think we're very much still programmed to have children spaced 4 years apart and to have lots of help with those children. So the phenomenon of like what I experienced being the mother of a 2-year-old toddler and a newborn baby and trying to take care of both of them while my husband went to work all day with no help from family and I almost died, that is not normal from an evolutionary perspective, right?
but very normal today.
Very normal today, right?
Yeah.
And I think you can feel it. Like, I am a planner, shocker. So I talked to a lot of moms and I was like, if you could, how would you space your kids? And I like overwhelmingly heard like, if you can, don't do 2 under 2, wait at least 3 years apart. And they were like, that way one is like more of a helper, like, you know, like one kid can just like eat by himself while you're like breastfeeding or whatever. And so this is a pretty common thing that I feel like the women who especially have babies closer together are like way more struggling, it seems to me anecdotally, than I feel like the moms who have a little bit more of spacing, like 3. And you know, even in that stupid baby book, right, like You're Being Pregnant, you know what I'm talking about, that classic book,
What to expect?
Expecting that.
What to expect when you're expecting.
Expect,
it says like the ideal spacing is 3 years, which is not 4, but
interesting.
But your doctor will tell you 18 months. Like,
and society or your partner, right?
I had no idea when I chose to have my kids close together. It was just like, oh, well, I'm at a company right now with great maternity leave, so let's do this. And I was 2 years apart with my brother. My husband is 2 years apart with his sister. We were just like, this is what people do, right? And I think my son was not ready for a sibling. It was really hard on him. It was really, really hard on me because I was not sleeping at night with the baby, but then I had to be up all day taking care of my toddler. And so that was the point when I like really started asking questions, like how, like we hear that sleep is good for us, but clearly it's impossible to get sleep. So what gives? Like what, how is this supposed to work? It doesn't make any sense to me. And I think to your point of having an older child helper, that to me is also a really fascinating component of this. Like if you think about how hunter-gatherers did this, they would start having kids like at age 20, and then they'd have like 4 children spaced 4 years apart. By the time you have the third child, the first one is 8. Like that child is absolutely capable of being a caregiver, not just a care receiver, like a helper, right? As opposed to like if you're doing, my paternal grandmother did 4 children in 6 years, like by the time she was having number 4, the oldest one still wasn't really capable of doing anything independently or of helping. And, she wound up having a brief hospital stay from a mental break because, she had no help. And 4 and 6 years is just not a natural thing. So moms usually made it. The data suggests that birth was not as risky in the Paleolithic as we sometimes make it out to be.
Okay.
I think the maternal death rate is estimated to be like 1 in 150, which would be that would be unacceptable by today's standards. But also when you consider that there was like no medicine, no intervention, it's pretty good. And then when it comes to infant survival, that's where the odds were indeed very bad. I think the data is 20% infant mortality before age 1, and then something like maybe 50, maybe as high as 50% before reaching adolescence. So yeah, they lost a lot of children. That's certainly one reason not to want to go back to a full-blown hunter-gatherer society. But yeah, what would have happened, the way that would have worked is that it would have even further reduced the number of dependent children in a group, which is not to say it was a good thing. I don't think we want to make that trade-off. But, the reality
difference, right? Like now, if you do have 4 kids in 5 years or whatever,
they're all going to survive.
You're
most likely going to have all 4, which maybe that wasn't necessarily as true.
It wasn't necessarily the case.
Particularly if you're breastfeeding for 1, 2, 3 years, you're probably also spacing out.
So the way it would have happened is that, usually, so a woman would have her first child at 20, because another really interesting thing about hunter-gatherer societies is that women didn't become fertile until they were like 19 or 20 years old. They usually didn't start their periods until they were like 17. And then they would have 3 years of what we call anovulatory cycles, so where they're not fertile, before they were able to become pregnant. So the reproductive cycle started much later. And then first kid around 20, then you would breastfeed that child for maybe 3 years, and you wouldn't even be capable of becoming pregnant until 4 years later. So 4 years later, another child, 20% chance of losing either one of those. So, maybe at some point you lose, say, the second, then you would resume cycling more quickly because you're not breastfeeding, which means maybe the actual spacing between your first and second surviving children would be more like 6 years. But at the end of the day, I think when you factor in child mortality, you have a scenario where most mothers are raising about 3 children to adulthood. So it's funny because I think that we tend to think of our very low fertility rates in the modern context as being kind of weird or abnormal, but they're actually closer to the fertility rates that were in place for most of human evolution than, say, your great-great-grandmother who had a family of 13, right? Like that is actually the thing that is an outlier.
Mm.